5, 4,
3,
2,
1.
but who's counting, right? And his name is Major.
Oh, ladies and gentlemen,
please welcome Major Garrett.
From the nation's capital.
Major, fantastic.
It's The Takeout.
This is a major achievement.
With CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent,
Major Garrett, yes, CBS, yes, hi.
Major Garrett.
Major, that's nonsense, and you should know better.
Is Major out of the doghouse?
The answer is yes.
Welcome to the very best part of my broadcast week. I'm Major Garrett. It's good to have you with us. However you find this show, podcast platforms, you're our earliest and beloved adopters, radio stations around this great country, CBS News Streaming, and of course, Sirius XM POTUS Channel 124. We have two hosts this week. We are at the Yours Truly Hotel, downtown D.C., next to it, and they're the supplier of our coffee this morning, Call Your Mother. So, now that we've got all that out of the way, ladies and gentlemen who are with this show on a regular basis, you know that in late February of this year, something happened that had not happened in Europe for nearly 70 years. A conventional war was launched by one country against another. It was a war, as all wars are, of choice and aggression. War crimes have been alleged by any rational measurement. War crimes have been committed by Russia in Ukraine. You'll recall at that time, this show devoted about 6 straight weeks to the implications of that war, that conventional war, Russia against Ukraine. We haven't devoted as much attention to that lately, but the story is still no less important as it was in late February of this year. I want to get back to that story and its implications, not just for Europe, but for the United States, with a special guest. John Sullivan, he's just back to the United States. He was the U.S. ambassador in Russia from 2020 to 2022, possibly in U.S.-Russian relations, the most important 2 years since the dawn of the Cold War. John Sullivan, it's great to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Major. It's great to be with you. Good to see you.
So help my audience get a perspective, because they may not have seen as many headlines in the last couple of months as they did in February, March, April, May. Where is the war, Russia against Ukraine? What should we be looking for in the next few weeks?
Well, a couple of things, Major. It's, of course, at the very start of the war, I think everybody worldwide was surprised by the heroic Ukrainian resistance, and there's no other word for it than heroic.
And let me just stop you there. There was a legitimate fear within the U.S. government that Ukraine would fall.
It wasn't just a fear; it was an expectation. I personally wouldn't have been shocked if Zelensky had been killed, or if the
government decapitated and the country overrun.
If the Russians had done to Zelensky what Brezhnev and the Soviets did to Dubček in Prague in 1968, sent 200,000 Warsaw Pact troops in, seize Dubček, put him on a plane, take him to Moscow. I would have thought that's the best that can happen to Zelensky if he lives. But I'm not a military expert. But those experts themselves were not expecting what happened. And it was a colossal failure by, it's not just the Russian military, it's their entire security system. It's the FSB, it's their border guards. They went into this military operation sort of on the cheap from their military side, their Ministry of Defense. The number of Russian soldiers actually who were involved, if the total number of Russians who went into Ukraine was somewhere around 180 or 200,000, they weren't all military. It was the FSB, it was border guards, and it was a continuation of
and
a
FSB
hybrid,
is the security service.
the successor to the KGB.
Right.
It was a continuation of a hybrid war they had been waging against Ukraine for years.
In the East.
And throughout Ukraine, with cyber, you name it. But to your question about more recently, so the Ukrainians pushed them back from the strike on Kyiv and in Kharkiv, but the Russians make significant advances in the south, and they captured this important city of Kherson. And then the action is focused on the east in the Donbass. What's happened recently is the Ukrainian military has pushed the Russians back in the south, pushed them out of the city, of this important city of Kherson. And the Russians have been really on their heels for months now. The problem that the military, the Ukrainian military has is it's very cold, it's been muddy, it's been more difficult in this season for them to operate, but they've pledged to continue their military operations. And it's not going well for the Russian military on the ground. In response, the Russians have been launching standoff weapons, missiles, to blast the heck out of infrastructure in Ukraine because they can't make progress on the ground. And here's the final point on the most recent events. They've been launching those missiles primarily from bombers that are flying either over the Caspian Sea or in Russian airspace, standoff munitions. What the Ukrainians did recently is launch drones to attack the air bases deep inside of Russia from which those planes have taken off and they've launched missiles. So, the Ukrainians, they didn't just surprise the United States or the ambassador. The people who were the most surprised were the Russians. They didn't expect this.
And let's just spend a second or two, John Sullivan, most recently back in the United States as ambassador representing this country in Russia. These attacks on infrastructure are meant to plunge Ukrainian civilians into darkness, coldness, and limit their ability to feed themselves. This is a darkness and starvation strategy.
Correct.
It is as barbaric as it gets.
Absolutely. If what the Russians would say is that we're attacking, for example, power stations that provide power that the Ukrainian military uses. Well, that's taking. They are not launching these strikes on water treatment facilities, electrical generating stations, because the Ukrainian military has its own generators. They can power themselves. What they're really doing is attacking civilian infrastructure, bringing the war to 40-plus million Ukrainian citizens in the middle of a winter. And having been to Kyiv and been even further north for 3 years and lived in Moscow, it's cold in Moscow today. I think the high yesterday was 9 degrees Fahrenheit. It's barbaric.
Any doubt in your mind, John Sullivan, most recently back from Moscow as U.S. ambassador to Russia, that Russia has committed war crimes in this?
So if you would ask me that question as ambassador, what I would say as a cautious diplomat was that there was ample evidence for there to be widespread investigations of multiple, innumerable war crimes because of the evidence we've seen. If you ask me as John Sullivan walking down the street or sitting here having a cup of coffee, hell yeah. I've seen the pictures. I've seen the video. I got a video. I got pictures after there was a Russian missile strike on a train station in Kramatorsk in Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine. And one of my colleagues at the embassy in Kyiv, we got evidence of what had happened, the aftermath, and she sent me an email in advance to tell me she was sending these photographs. Why? She said, because I couldn't, you have to prepare yourself. Right. You can't just click on this. You're not going to believe what you're going to see. Right. And I was grateful for her that she had warned me, because I'm sitting in my comfortable office in Moscow, and I click on that link and I see the photographs of, the baby carriages and the stuffed animals
and worse.
And worse. I mean, it was...
Without going into too much detail, you saw the after effects on humanity.
It's horrific. All war is, right?
Missiles.
Which is what makes... Well, so there's the missile strikes themselves, which are barbaric. But war itself, I mean, it's Shakespeare, right? Cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war. That's what makes February 24th, in my opinion, so significant. They launched a full-scale, no-holds-barred ground war on an independent, sovereign country of 44 million people in the middle of the European continent. And they thought it was going to be over in weeks, and yeah, they thought they were going to subjugate Afghanistan too.
Right.
So
that is the voice of John Sullivan. You can tell already why I'm so glad he is with us to talk about this story, the story of the year, and there's no real competition. The war in Ukraine is the story of the calendar year 2022 More of that conversation with John Sullivan for segment 2 of the Takeout. When we come back, I'm Major Garrett. We'll see you in just a second.
I think it's the story of the decade because this isn't going to end anytime soon.
It's not.
It's not.
From CBS News, this is The Takeout with Major Garrett.
Welcome back to the Takeout. Call your mother. That's always good advice. It also happens to be the supplier of our coffee here inside the Yours Truly Hotel downtown D.C. Grateful to both. I'm Major Garrett. Welcome back to the Takeout. John Sullivan, recently back in the United States as U.S. Ambassador to Russia, 2020 to 2022. John, tell my audience what it should know and remember and admire about Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine.
He is an unexpected hero. Historians talk about, do individuals influence the course of history? I remember as a history major in college, is it really broad social movements, economic factors? Here's a guy that everybody on both sides of the conflict, including, I would bet, most Ukrainians, who people thought after the war started on February 24th, this guy's got a shelf life that can be measured in hours. And he has the nerve to stay there in Kyiv when everybody is telling him to get out. But more than that, he's broadcasting, he's speaking to the world, particularly to the Europeans. And in the 24 and 48 hours after that war, when we saw this enormous change across Europe, particularly in Germany, the impact of that guy in his green T-shirt with the full might of the Russian military bearing down on him to have his head on a platter, and he has the nerve to stay there and tell the world what's happening, why he's not leaving, that, I believe, had a significant, and it's continued to have an influence. The moral authority he has to speak now, and the Russians, of course, it infuriates them because they have no respect for him. Absolutely, I mean, he is the phrase beneath contempt. He's exhibited. He is beneath contempt for Putin. Putin can't tolerate the guy, and the fact that he has been this brave and this effective, I am sure, is in Putin's head and driving him crazy.
As I listened to you, it was, from your perspective, a crystallizing moment in the history of this story. Zelensky standing.
Absolutely.
And not abdicating, not fleeing.
Absolutely.
And that had an effect that was both psychological and practical in Europe. And you said Germany especially. Why Germany especially?
Well, because Germany and France, the Germans and the French, the Chancellor and the President, are the two most significant.
They're the leaders of Europe.
And Germany in particular with its economic throw weight. And Germany has been, both for historical reasons and because of proximity and economic relations, as close to the Russians as any NATO member. We'll put Turkey to one side. The Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which we can talk about. I mean, their connections to Russia, and it's historic. Putin himself in the KGB served in Dresden for years. So the fact that that country and across the political spectrum in Germany pivoted and people realized, the German ambassador in Washington, who's a friend of mine, Emily Haber, wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post yesterday or 2 days ago in which she described the pretty dramatic shift in German views on Russia. I'm not saying it's all Zelensky, but boy, he personified it, and he had the courage to do it, and still does. There's still, I mean, every day he's in Kyiv, he's a target.
No doubt. No doubt. Let me ask you a self-congratulatory question. Why am I right to say this is the story of the year in 2022?
Could I beg to differ?
Sure.
I think it's the story of the decade. because this isn't going to end anytime soon.
It's not.
It's not.
Okay.
You're right. It's the story of 2022. It's going to continue. There's for the foreseeable future, neither side, neither Putin nor Zelensky, neither the Russians, the nationalist Russians, nor almost all Ukrainians, they don't want to quit. The Ukrainians are fighting for their lives, and so they're entrenched in their views. President Zelensky has said he's not negotiating to give away Ukrainian territory. I don't think he has the political room to do that, even if he wanted to. He wouldn't be president of Ukraine anymore. It's one of the catastrophic failures of Putin's invasion, aggressive war against Ukraine. He's driven those Slavic sisters and brothers in Ukraine that Putin says are part of this Ruski Mir, this Russian world. He's driven them so far away and against Russia. And then Putin himself, he doesn't want an off-ramp. I used to joke with people always ask me, what's the off-ramp for Putin, right? That's the usual question. And I've joked with Secretary Blinken. I said, he doesn't want an off-ramp. It's like General Sherman's statement about not running for president. If offered an off-ramp, he will not, Putin will not take it. He doesn't want it. He won't take it. What he does want, though, if we want to continue the turnpike analogy, the highway analogy, he wants a rest area. He wants if you're on the Jersey Turnpike, the Vince
I've been there once or twice, yeah.
He wants the Vladimir Vladimirovich rest area.
What does that mean strategically?
That means he needs to regroup, re-equip, and rethink how he's going to conquer Ukraine. Because, by God, all the Russians say this, all the Russians from the top down, the goals of the special military operation will be achieved. They've been saying that for day one. They can't, with us, even in a country where official lies are a way of life, they can't continue to say it's going according to plan. They've stopped saying that, even when it was clear it wasn't. What they won't stop saying is, it may not be going according to plan, but they won't stop saying that the goals are going to be achieved. And what are the goals he wants? He wants a Ukraine that's subjugated. He wants a Ukraine that is, at a minimum, as pliant and in his corner as Belarus is, which is
effectively
another country.
A client state.
You know what?
If more,
exactly.
Not more.
So you know what the phrase is? The Russian Federation and Belarus have a treaty, and they're called union states. It's the union state of Russia and Belarus, and it's part of Putin's idea of this Russian world. That he's regathering Russian lands that were conquered during the Russian Empire, during, going back to Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. Ukraine's part of it. It's Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia. They call it Triune Russia. It's and they're Slavs, they're Russian, they're Orthodox, and Putin thinks they all need to be part of one entity that he controls. Now, there could be nominal borders, there could be nominal governments in Minsk and Kyiv, but they got to be favorable to him.
But to your point a moment ago, what he's done in the mentality of the Slavs who live in Ukraine, who might have theoretically or conceptually been open to this, they're no longer open because they've seen the bullet, the bayonet, the missile, and worse.
Their mothers, their fathers, their brothers, their sisters have been slaughtered. The casualty figures
kind of an impediment to a rapprochement.
You would think, right? It's the casualty figures, I think, for civilians, the casualty figures are understated. The figures for the internally displaced persons and refugees are not. So, I've seen figures of 10,000, Ukrainians, innocent people, civilians killed. I think that's a pretty significant understatement. I'm not an expert, but my gut instinct is that's an understatement. What's not in dispute is that almost 15 million, this is a country of 44 million people, a third of the population has been driven from its homes.
Displaced.
They're either internally displaced within Ukraine, roughly half of the 15 million, or they've had to flee the country.
To Poland or someplace else.
15 million people.
Right.
So with the United States, a country of what, 340 million people? Imagine if a third of our population, 100+ million people, had to leave their homes.
Right.
How would Americans feel about whoever had caused that?
The voice of John Sullivan, recently back in the United States. He's teaching at Columbia and Georgetown. He was from 2020 to 2022 the U.S. ambassador in Russia. That meant he worked for President Trump and President Biden. Not very many people can say that. I'm Major Garrett, segment 3 of The Takeout, coming your way in just 1 minute.
They want to avoid another war like World War II. They have started another war like World War II.
From CBS News, this is The Takeout with Major Garrett.
Welcome back to The Takeout. I will spend a moment, just a smidge of time, with our CBS News streaming audience watching. I want to show you this. So we don't collect a lot of swag here at The Takeout, but this is at the very top of all swag collected. Hockey puck. I played hockey as a kid in San Diego, played it as an adult here in the D.C. area for several years before my children were born. From the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, signed by our guest, John Sullivan, on the back. You can see that there. That is a prized possession. So, Mr. Ambassador, thank you.
Oh,
Thank
you're
you for
welcome,
that.
Major.
So I want to say something that is not in defense of Russia's ideology behind this war, but it is nevertheless true. The Russians regard their history in the 20th century as an invaded people twice. Right. They also remember Napoleon being invaded then and having to defend their land against European invaders. You could put the Poles and the Swedes in there how far back you want, but this is part of a Russian orientation to the world that is not irrelevant to this topic. And to say that and put it on the table is not to justify it, but it's to say it is a real part of their lived history. Yep. If you look at the casualties from World War II, America in 2 theaters, Europe and Asia, lost about 700,000 and 800,000 military personnel. Russia lost more than 22 million, if you add it all up, civilian and military, but mostly military. They remember that. It's deeply embedded in their psyche and is part of this narrative within Russia that, to the degree it matters, sustains this war. True? At least in part.
Absolutely. And I respect that point of view.
And that history.
That history, obviously, in crediting the Red Army with their victory, which they celebrate as victory in the Great Patriotic War. They don't really acknowledge that there was a war in the Pacific, the Great Patriotic War, which would have been news to my father and his brother. My father on a submarine, his brother on a destroyer in the Pacific. That would have been news to them. But I engaged with a lot of Russians, both in the Russian government, from at the very top, the Foreign Minister Lavrov, and Russian academics, discussing Russia's security concerns, needs, but they jumped the shark on January 24th.
February 24th.
February 24th. You can't. They did the very thing they're trying to avoid. They want to avoid another war like World War II. They have started another war like World War II without any justification. Among things they've said, Ukraine was going to invade Russia. That's preposterous.
Right.
The United States we're not going to invade Russia. We didn't invade the Soviet Union. It's preposterous. So I think it's used by Russian leaders, by President Putin. It's a way to motivate and develop an esprit among Russians, calling upon the memory of their grandparents and the Great Patriotic War. And we have got to protect our homeland. But you can't protect your homeland by waging an unprovoked, immoral, illegal, massive war on the continent, which, if you were concerned about security, you're trying to prevent in the first place.
Right, and there's also this rhetorical flourish about, as you said earlier, beneath contempt, almost a mongrelization of Ukraine, calling them Nazis and worse.
So, absolutely, and it's tied, as the Russians senior Russian officials, including Foreign Minister Lavrov, as they continue to make these arguments, they tie themselves into knots and wind up making ridiculous statements. So, as you mentioned, Major, they say that the Ukrainian government is engaged in a genocide against Russians in Ukraine, and it's a Nazi-led and inspired genocide. And in response to the question, I believe it was an Italian journalist said to the foreign minister of Russia, how can you say that when the democratically elected president of Ukraine, you say he's a Nazi? He's a Jew whose grandfather fought in the Red Army. And you know what Lavrov said? Lavrov said, well, it's well known that Hitler himself was at least part Jewish, so you can be Jewish and still be a Nazi. It caused enormous problems. It caused problems.
We call that a stretch.
A bit, right?
Diplomatically.
He's tagged out at first base. He tried to stretch to make it back to first, and he did not make it. Putin had to call the Israeli prime minister to apologize. But it's an example of they'll say anything.
Right.
But one thing I wanted to
justify the unjustifiable.
Justify the unjustifiable. One thing you said, and you're quite right with the statistics, but you said Russia, in Russian casualties in the Second World War, it was the Soviet
Union. Right.
And you know what's important to note? And I used to have the statistics on the tip of my tongue. I believe per capita, military and civilian casualties in the Soviet Union during the Second World War per capita, Ukraine and Belarus had higher per capita casualties
because they were part
Russia,
of the Soviet Union. Yes.
Part of the Red Army. I believe there's a famous picture of U.S. soldiers and Red Army soldiers meeting on the Elbe River.
Mm-hmm.
Those are Ukrainians.
Wow.
Here's another fact. I believe this is true. My Russian trolls will correct me if I misspeak. There's a huge number. I won't make a comparison to Russia. I'll just say there's a huge number of Ukrainians who were declared heroes of the Soviet Union posthumously for their sacrifices in the Great Patriotic War. What Putin has done is basically, you talk about besmirching their legacy. Mm-hmm. They fought for their, sure, they were fighting for the Red Army in the Soviet Union, but it was their town that had been occupied by the Nazis. And they died by the thousands in Ukraine, Ukrainians, to expel the Nazis. And what Putin has done is sweep that under the rug. Mm-hmm. He claims everything good that the Soviet Union did, which wasn't a lot, was Russia. Anything bad, like the famine in Ukraine, fake news, or
didn't happen.
Ignore,
not our fault.
Don't pay any attention to that.
Right. So, some in my audience may remember at various stages of this war stories about, is Putin physically well? Is he mentally well? What's your take on both?
I believe my friend Bill Burns said this.
Burns?
Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, former ambassador to Russia, several years before I was Deputy Secretary of State. He was Deputy Secretary of State. He's made something of himself.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So Bill became Director of Central Intelligence. I got sent to Siberia after being Deputy Secretary. I used that line on him, and he chuckles. But Bill said the problem with Putin's health is that he's too healthy. There's no reason, we don't have reason to believe that he is in imminent
Any
health
physical distress?
Well,
How is he mentally?
Sticking on physical for the time being, the last time I've been in his presence a fair number of times, but not in the last year, physically. As I've been as close to him as I am to you now, and every time I was, including last summer, summer of 21, he looked great, really great. You would not have thought. He was then 69 years old. He's now 70. I'm several years younger than he, and he looks a whole heck of a lot healthier than I do. But this year, at least on camera, he seems puffy, fatigued. He must be under a huge amount of stress, but
not as much stress as Ukrainian civilians, clearly.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, he's he's I wonder what he thinks though about. He was very confident.
But there's
that his
nothing.
military,
There's nothing in your mind that would suggest to the world that his grip on power is shaky, or his ability mentally to see his way through the next year or two is in any way compromised.
I don't have any reason to think. I believe he is supremely rational. I don't think he's irrational. But as the war goes on and the stress for him mounts, I think some of the statements that we've heard and other senior Russian government officials have made, they're pretty extreme.
Right. Which may be indicative of some other underlying tensions.
Yeah.
That's the voice of John Sullivan. Segment 4 of The Takeout coming your way in just one moment. Stay tuned.
We think other people behave and act like us in the West, and they have a different viewpoint. He has a different viewpoint.
From CBS News, this is The Takeout with Major Garrett.
Welcome back to The Takeout. John Sullivan, recently back from Moscow, where he was U.S. Ambassador to Russia 2020 to 2022, is our guest. You can't explain Vladimir Putin. I wouldn't ask you to do that. But what should my audience most remember about who he is and what he is setting in motion in Ukraine?
The first thing that comes to my mind is, Major, is that we in the United States often we hear what he says, but we don't really listen and absorb it. He's been telling us not precisely what was going to happen for years. And we in the West...
Before the war started, he had a whole letter where he wrote basically his grievances what... Get up close to the mic, John.
His grievances, and he's been talking about this since he gave a famous speech in Munich in 2006, 7. We don't listen. In some sense, it's hard for us. I noticed this across the board in Russia. We want to hear what we want to hear, and we think other people behave and act like us in the West, and they have a different viewpoint. He has a different viewpoint, and we need to do a better job of listening and really paying attention, which is why when he makes threats about nuclear weapons, we take them seriously. I don't think he's going to use them. I don't think the U.S. government assesses that he's going to use them, the statements I've seen. But we need to listen when he talks.
When you say you don't think he's going to use them, is part of that, if he was going to use them, he would have used them already?
Yeah, I've seen things that suggest that the dispersal of Ukrainian armed forces, that tactically it wouldn't give him much of a military advantage. I think the bigger problem for him is, and this veers into a whole different, larger area, is China. So there was his famous visit to Beijing right before the Olympics, right?
Yep.
And he and Xi Jinping announced this new unlimited, no limits partnership, right? But we found out that there is a limit.
There is a limit.
No nukes.
There's always a limit.
No nukes. She said that.
Yep.
Modi,
India's prime minister?
they're not going to, if he uses a nuclear weapon, and Xi has said that. So there are limits to, and Xi has said it. Now, we said it in a way, it wasn't directed at Russia, but it's not as though the Ukrainians are going to use nuclear weapons.
I'm glad you mentioned Prime Minister Modi. On this program, many, many months ago, Mark Warner, co-chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee, said, in response to a question from me, that he was deeply disappointed in India sitting on the sidelines effectively during this war as the world's largest democracy. Are you?
Yes.
What do you think their game is here?
Well, part of it is, I mean, India has been over decades had a close relationship with the Soviet Union. Its military has. It's dependent on, just as Ukraine has been, as the world has discovered with, the Ukrainians using old weapons going back, to Soviet production. India had a similarly close relation, not as close as Ukraine and Russia, but the Indian military had a very close relationship with the Soviet Union. The split was U.S., Pakistan, India, Soviet Union. It's in part a legacy of that. But I share Senator Warner's view. I'm not surprised about Xi Jinping's reaction, but for a democratically elected leader of
India may come to regret that over time.
Particularly given the claims to territory that it considers its own by Pakistan and China.
No doubt, no doubt. For the audience who's listening, John Sullivan, why should the United States care about the future of Ukraine in 2023, and why should American taxpayers continue to send financial, meaning economic, and military aid?
Well, look, we can discuss whether it's appropriate to send certain weapon systems to Ukraine, our level of financial support, burden sharing with our allies. My view is that it is in the United States' national security interest to continue the President Biden's support, financial and with weapons, carefully considered weapons sales and donations to Ukraine. But here's what we can't take our eye off: the threat that Vladimir Putin and the Russian nationalists who've launched this aggressive war pose. What happened on February 24th, as you said at the outset, Major, hadn't happened on the European continent in 77 years. My father, my uncles fought in that war. Now, the Japanese Empire had attacked our Navy at Pearl Harbor. I'm not suggesting this is World War II. It's not a global conflict. But think about this. The country that has launched this aggressive war with all of the evidence of war crimes that we've seen, that has upended the global economy, and so forth. And Ukraine is obviously the biggest victim, but the Russians themselves are the second biggest victim. Think about the fact that the country that did this is one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council of the United Nations and can veto every proposal that goes before the UN Security Council. What does it say? What does it tell Xi Jinping, other potential other leaders who have claims to territory, real or imagined, that it's okay to launch an aggressive war and kill civilians in another country to fulfill those claims? We can't allow that to happen, and we have to. And this is why when I mentioned the transformation in Germany, the Germans realize we're not dealing with a government leadership that they have gone beyond all reasonable bounds that would constrain any moral government that complies with international law and its obligations under the UN Charter. So this is a big deal, and it's going to be a big deal for a long time because this violence isn't going to stop anytime soon.
Quick answer from you, please. Do you believe on the other side of this there will be a reassessment of that Security Council, an enlargement to possibly dilute Russia's influence?
I believe it is under consideration and discussion. I think President Biden himself has mentioned it, right?
Right.
Whether it will actually happen, I mean, it's a chicken and egg. It's what the right analogy is, because Russia can veto.
Right.
So it would have to be the General Assembly. General Assembly has been a favorable forum for us, right? Right after the war, 141 countries. Think about the language they used. They condemned and deplored the Russian invasion and demanded that Russia withdraw. Now, 47 countries abstained,
right?
But
that's still a pretty good ratio. That is the voice of John Sullivan. For our radio audience, we need to bid you farewell. For those on CBS News Streaming and on the podcast platforms, stay tuned, as I know you always do, to the Takeout Outtake Especial. I'm Major Garrett. We'll see you next week.
They look at my playlist and they think, this guy's a nut. He's got Bob Marley. He's got Harry James. He's got, Willie Nelson.
From CBS News, this is The Takeout with Major Garrett.
Welcome to your Takeout Outtake Especial. I'm Major Garrett. John Sullivan is our special guest. John was, from 2020 to 2022, the U.S. ambassador to Russia, the two most consequential years since the Cold War in our relations. He also was Deputy Secretary of State, acting Secretary of State for 6 weeks between Rex Tillerson and Mike Pompeo in the Trump administration. He's also been counsel to presidential campaigns, been involved in government and politics and law at a very, very high level for most of his career. I want to talk to you about American journalists or pseudo-journalists on television who echo Russian propaganda about this war in Ukraine. What do you think about that?
Well, if they are doing it intentionally, it's despicable, and maybe more than that. If they fall into the trap of they think that Putin is in his own Slavic way, picked up the cudgel and engaged in the culture wars that we're having here, they are so sadly naive and misled. This is not a government in Moscow that is, they've just enacted legislation that basically makes it a crime for LGBTI individuals to express themselves, to mention it in any form, whether it's in the press, in a book. This is not, there was a Supreme Court case that was just argued yesterday, I think, or 2 days ago, about whether a baker or a photographer has to provide service for a gay couple that is getting married, and balancing their rights as a couple for to wed with the individual's right to have their religious views or moral views and not participate in that. That's not the debate that's going on in Russia today. We're talking about people, a government that is brutally suppressing gays and lesbians in Russia. I just use this as an example. They have crushed civil society, journalists,
dissent, journalism,
any independent journalists,
any criticism,
are either in a labor camp or left Russia. So, and now they have waged this aggressive war, which we've spent the last hour talking about, with all of its moral and legal implications. Anybody who is misled and thinks that the Russian Federation, as led by the current government in the Kremlin, is some sort of ally maybe, they wouldn't use the word ally, but, we need to cut them some slack. Mm-hmm. They're just defending their own tradition, their culture, which is what Putin himself says. That's baloney. Mm-hmm. That is baloney. That is it reminds me of the America Firsters during the 1930s, saying the same things about, there are famous news clips of Americans saying, geez, it's great what Chancellor Hitler has done in Germany and taken it out of the Depression and building highways and the trains are running on time. And, the Germans were really mistreated after the Great War in the Treaty of Versailles, and we need to cut the Chancellor some.
Yeah.
That's
echoes.
Morally, I believe, the equivalent of what those people are doing today. So we can talk about money and weapons and how much we can afford. What we can't debate is the moral imperative to support Ukraine and to get the rest of the world. We've done a pretty good job of it, but there's more work to be done. The rest of the world, China, India, etc., to support us.
My audience loves this part of the conversation because it has a fun and games dimension to it. So 3 questions that every guest at our show has taken and answered and enjoyed answering. So take these in whichever order you prefer, John Sullivan. Most influential book in your life and why? All-time favorite movie? And if you're on a long flight or a long drive and you're really going to enjoy some music, what music are you most likely to listen to, artist or genre?
Oh, my gosh. All right. Favorite movie is Casablanca.
Okay.
I watch it. I can't tell you how many times I've watched it. It's going to offend a lot of my friends who know I'm probably more knowledgeable about The Godfather. Let me amend that. Godfather is 1A, Casablanca is 1B. When I gave remarks when I got sworn in before a big crowd at the State Department, sworn in as ambassador, and the thesis of my remarks was, why am I leaving Mahogany Row and this cushy job as Deputy Secretary of State to go to Russia? President Trump, by the way, thought I was crazy. He couldn't believe I wanted to do it. And I said, I can tell you why, and I will quote from The Godfather. The very first line of the movie, for those of you who know the screen is black,
Yep.
I believe in America.
Yep.
And that was my theme throughout. So Godfather is one. So I'm thinking out loud here. So I'm going to, Godfather is one.
The funeral home
Casablanca's
director
close
says
second.
that. I believe in America.
I believe in, exactly.
Yep.
Exactly. And
He later has to do a favor for The Godfather.
that day may never come, and then it did come
Yep.
when Sonny got whacked at the toll booth.
Book.
Oh God, book.
I'm sure there are many choices.
Yeah, let me take that under advisement.
Sure.
And the third
Music.
Okay. I have my Spotify playlists are crazy, eclectic. I used to like to say, because the Russians would monitor all of whatever electronic devices I had, and the FSB, the KGB successor, has a large unit. We think it's well over 5,000, maybe 7,000 officers who are dedicated to smothering the U.S. mission, the U.S. embassy in Moscow. So they got a lot of people who are looking at what I do, what I read, what I say, etc. And I said, they look at my playlist and they think, this guy's a nut. He's got Bob Marley, he's got Harry James, he's got Willie Nelson, Linda Ronstadt. It's a pretty eclectic. I'd have to say Willie.
Okay.
Willie. Oh boy, book. Jeez. Wow. Catch-22.
Mm-hmm. You might imagine I know that book well because there's a character, Major.
I am well aware of that.
So as a child, I kept being asked, have you read Catch-22? And I'm
So-
like, my name is Major. I know all about it. I'm 7.
Well, in thinking of your name, Major, I now know that you are a hockey player and a hockey fan.
I am.
But when I think of Major Garrett and I think of that name, I think that's the name of a running back for a high-powered SEC offense. Major Garrett,
Yes.
a tailback for Alabama.
There was an Alabama running back named Major Ogilvy.
Major Ogilvy.
Yes.
Really kind of a tragic figure.
Mhm.
And,
Yep.
So, anyway.
Anyway, there we
Yep.
go. Very good. John Sullivan, a pleasure. Thanks so much for spending time with us. We'll see you
Bye.
We'll see you again next week, folks.